All right, so we have, when we first start working with variables, we first start working with equations. Those are problems with equal signs. We start out with one-step equations. After we get really comfortable with one-step equations, we move on to two-step equations. Once we get confident with two-step equations, we move on to multi-step, 3 or more. Jacob and Joseph, are you taking notes? So you don't need a dry erase marker in your hand. So multi-step equations are going to have 3 or more steps to solve. 3 or more steps are going to be required to solve a multi-step equation. 3 or more, multi. I mean, you could still have a two-step equation, that's okay. But two-step equations, we should be able to identify them and be able to solve them. Lots of us, in fact, can do two-step equations without really showing a lot of work. You have a calculator in your hand and you just apply inverse operations and it works. Multi-step equations are a little more difficult because they have more steps, more things to keep track of, right? So the first thing we want to do for a multi-step equation is we need to ask ourselves, are there parentheses? Because if there are parentheses, order of operations, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, PEMDAS, says you should always do the parentheses first. Do you agree? Yeah. However, this is a multi-step equation, meaning we're solving for a variable, correct? And when there are parentheses and a variable, we can't do the parentheses. So if there are parentheses, you have to do the distributive property. For example, if I had the problem are there parentheses? Yes, there are parentheses in this problem, but I cannot do x minus 2. Why can't I do x minus 2?
You don't know the value of x.
I don't know what x is, so I can't do it. So I have to do the distributive property. So the distributive property is multiply the number outside the parentheses to everything inside the parentheses. Multiply the number outside the parentheses to everything inside the parentheses. And this is done, I like to do it, I circle the number outside and I draw arrows inside because it helps my brain remember what I'm doing. I would take this problem and I would circle the 4 and I would draw arrows to everything inside and I would multiply. After you use the distributive property, are there parentheses? After looking to see, are there parentheses? If yes, we have to use the distributive property. The second thing we look for, are there like terms? Are there parentheses? If yes, there are parentheses, then you're going to use the distributive property. If there are parentheses, use the distributive property. Number 2, are there like terms? What are like terms? How do you define like terms? Kinley, what are like terms? Perfect. We look for exactly the same variable. And like terms, we add or subtract depending on what the operations tell us. Add or subtract the coefficients. And the variable stays the same. We add or subtract the coefficients, and the variable stays the same. So the first thing you look at, are there parentheses? If there are parentheses, you're going to have to distribute. Then you're going to multiply the number outside the parentheses, right, to everything inside. Rewrite the problem. Then we look, are there like terms? Maybe there are no parentheses. Maybe you can skip this. Maybe there are just like terms that need to be combined. And once you do step 1, then step 2, it should be a 2-step problem. Or maybe even a 1-step. Maybe you got rid of something. And how do you solve an equation? You solve it by using inverse operations. If it's a plus 10, the opposite is minus 10. If it's a positive 3, the opposite is minus 3. If it's multiplied by 2, the opposite is divide by 2. Right? Inverse operations. All right, I'm going to give you some examples to practice at your table. So there are 2 examples.